Hello Nigerians, we have a breaking news and this is very serious. In Benue State right now, a governor is standing on a stage in front of his own people and he is saying in plain terms that no part of that state's land will be given away. Not to the federal government, not to pastoralists, not to anybody without the people themselves agreeing to it first. I need you to stay with me to the end of this one because this story touches land, it touches security, it touches history between farmers and herders that has cost this country too many lives already, and it touches a federal policy that is only 2 weeks old but is already causing serious tension. This is Benue State, Katsina-Ala, Ukum, Logo, Kwande, Sankera, communities that have already buried people because of this same farmer-herder crisis. And now here comes a national ranching program that has put their state on a federal list without, they say, anybody properly asking them first. Before I continue, if you are new to this channel, do well to like this video and subscribe because we bring you the news the way it actually happened. No sugarcoating, no bias, just facts. Now, back to the news.
Let's start with exactly what happened, because in this business, facts matter more than noise. The man at the center of this story is Governor Hyacinth Alia of Benue State, a Catholic priest before he became governor, now the chief security officer and chief executive of a state that has suffered some of the worst farmer-herder violence in this country. On Tuesday, Alia held a town hall meeting with stakeholders from what is called the Sankera bloc, that is, Katsina-Ala, Ukum, and Logo local government areas. This was not a private chat. This was a public engagement on record with community leaders, political stakeholders, and residents present. And at that meeting, the governor made his position on land and ranching unmistakably clear. He said no one would force Benue to give up even an inch of its land to pastoralists for any purpose. And he made a pointed promise that as long as he remains governor of Benue State, this will not happen on his watch. Multiple newsrooms covering that town hall, Premium Times, Daily Trust, Politics Nigeria, and others all carried versions of that same statement, which tells you this was said clearly in public and was not in dispute afterward. That is fact number one, confirmed and documented.
Now, here is the part many Nigerians watching this may not fully understand yet. So let's build the documentary trail properly. This entire controversy did not come from nowhere. It is tied directly to the federal government's national ranching policy, a program announced by the Minister of Livestock Development, Idoma. Under this policy, 6 locations were named for the pilot phase: Benue, Plateau, Nasarawa, Kaduna, Adamawa, and the Federal Capital Territory. According to the federal government's own explanation, these particular states were chosen precisely because of their long history of farmer-herder conflict, the idea being that modern, fenced ranching facilities could reduce the open, cross-country movement of cattle that has so often sparked deadly clashes between herders and farming communities. The pilot program itself is expected to begin first at the Wase Grazing Reserve in Plateau State before any expansion into the other listed states, including Benue. So on paper, this is a federal attempt to solve a national problem. But the moment Benue name appeared on that list, alarm bells started ringing across the state. Because for many Benue people, ranching policy and handing over ancestral land sound like the same thing, whether the federal government intends it that way or not.
Let's go back to exactly what the governor said, word for word, because in a story like this, the exact language matters. Speaking directly to his people, Alia declared, "I will never cede any part of Benue land to herdsmen." That is a direct quote, reported the same way across several Nigerian newsrooms. He didn't stop there. During his address, he tied the land question to the broader picture of insecurity in the state, telling his audience that Benue will defeat insecurity and pledging to protect what he called the lives, property, and ancestral lands of the people. This was not a one-off statement either. Alia repeated this same message just days later while addressing a different set of stakeholders from Sankera, Kwande, and Jechira federal constituencies as part of what his office described as a 5-day statewide thank you tour meant to appreciate residents for their political support and to engage directly with traditional rulers, religious leaders, and community stakeholders across the state. So what we have documented on the record in more than one setting is a governor consistently and repeatedly rejecting the idea of ceding Benue land, whether that pressure comes from the federal government's ranching policy or from any other direction.
Now, here is something important for context. Governor Alia was not the first voice in Benue to reject this ranching plan. Before he even spoke, 3 major socio-cultural organizations in the state had already gone on record opposing Benue's inclusion in the pilot program. These are Mzo Utif, representing the Tiv people, Ochetohak Idoma, representing the Idoma people, and Omikni Igede, representing the Igede people, the 3 largest ethnic nationalities in Benue State. According to Premium Times reporting from the 14th of August, these groups argued that pastoral settlements should not be established on Benue land without the consent of both the state government and the affected communities. Their reasoning was direct. They said Benue was still dealing with serious insecurity and the displacement of farming communities from their ancestral homes, and that the priority right now should be securing those affected areas and helping displaced residents return home, not opening new land arrangements for herders. They also raised a specific legal point worth noting carefully, that any livestock development program in Benue must comply with the state's own open grazing prohibition and ranches establishment law of 2017, a law that already restricts open grazing across the state. So, by the time the governor spoke, he was in many ways echoing a position his own people had already staked out publicly. Now, let's talk about the other side of this same announcement, because Governor Alia did not just talk about land. He paired that message with concrete security commitments, and this is where the facts get very specific. He announced the deployment of 3 military operational units to strategic flashpoints in the Sankera axis. Those units, he said, would be stationed at Agu in Katsina-Ala local government area, Ayin in Logo local government area, and Azendeshi in Ukum local government area. These units, according to the governor, would operate under the newly created Nigerian Army 5 Division, a division specifically established to handle security operations in that part of the country. On top of that, Alia disclosed that his administration would hand over 30 motorcycles to security agencies operating in the area, intended to improve patrol coverage and give a faster response time to emergencies and distress calls. During his thank you tour appearances, Alia also publicly commended President Bola Ahmed Tinubu for what he described as strengthening the state's security architecture, specifically crediting the federal government for establishing that Nigerian Army 5 Division in Benue. So here we have a governor doing 2 things at once, rejecting a federal land policy on one hand, while praising federal security support on the other. That combination is worth sitting with for a moment.
Now, as your anchor, let me be very careful here and separate for you what is officially documented from what remains interpretation, because that distinction matters enormously in a story this sensitive. Here is what we know for certain. Governor Alia made public statements on multiple occasions rejecting the ceding of Benue land for ranching purposes without the consent of his administration and the people. That is documented, on record, reported consistently. It is also a documented fact that the federal government's national ranching policy named Benue among 6 pilot locations, and that 3 major Benue socio-cultural groups publicly opposed that inclusion before the governor spoke. Those are facts. Now, here is what remains interpretation or allegation, not confirmed fact. Whether the federal government actually intends to force land acquisition in Benue without consent, or whether this is, as federal officials frame it, a voluntary consultative pilot program that has simply been misunderstood or politically amplified. Nobody has produced a document showing a forced land seizure order for Benue. What we have is a policy announcement, strong public rejection from state actors, and a governor speaking firmly to reassure his people. Those are 2 different things, and a responsible newsroom must never blur them.
Let's still man the federal government's side for a moment, because fairness demands it. Those who support the national ranching policy would argue that Nigeria has lost far too many lives, farmers and herders alike, to the current system of open, uncontrolled grazing, where cattle move across state and community lines with no fixed boundary, often trampling farmland and triggering violent reprisals on both sides. Supporters of ranching would say that establishing fixed, modern ranches with proper feed and water sources is actually a solution designed to protect farming communities in the long run, not threaten them, because it removes the very friction point that has caused so much bloodshed. They would also point out that the pilot is starting first in Plateau State, not Benue, which they might argue shows there is no rush to seize Benue land, and that engagement with Benue stakeholders could still happen before any implementation reaches that state. From this point of view, the anger in Benue, while understandable given the state's painful history, may be reacting to the idea of the policy, more than to any concrete federal action that has actually been taken against Benue specifically, at least so far.
Now, let's still man the Benue position with the same fairness. Those defending Governor Alia's stance and the position of the Tiv, Idoma and Igede groups would argue that Benue has already paid an enormous price in this farmer-herder crisis, with communities displaced from their ancestral homes, farmland abandoned, and lives lost over many years. From that lens, being named on a federal pilot list without direct, visible consultation with the state government and affected communities first would understandably feel like decisions being made about Benue people, without Benue people in the room. They would also argue that Benue already has its own law on this exact subject, the 2017 Open Grazing Prohibition and Ranches Establishment Law, and that any federal program touching land use in the state should, at minimum, operate within that existing legal framework, rather than appearing to sit above it or outside it. And they would say that until displaced Benue residents are resettled and the security situation is fully stabilized, introducing a new land use conversation risks reopening wounds that have not yet healed. Two sides, two legitimate sets of concerns. A national security and agriculture solution on one hand, a state's demand for consent and healing first on the other.
But let's step away from politics for a second and talk about who this actually affects. Because at the end of the day, this is not just a story about a governor and a federal ministry trading positions. This is about a farmer in Katsina-Ala who has already lost land once and is afraid of losing more. This is about a family displaced from Logo or Ukum, still waiting to go back to the home they were forced to leave. This is about herders too, many of whom are simply trying to feed their cattle and their families, and who often get painted with the same brush as the small minority responsible for violence. Whatever policy eventually emerges from this back and forth, whether it is federal ranching, state-level ranching under Benue's own law, or some hybrid arrangement, the real test will be whether it actually reduces the killings, reduces the displacement, and lets people go back to farming and grazing without fear. Everything else, every statement, every town hall, every federal announcement matters only to the extent that it moves the needle on that one basic outcome. Because right now, ordinary Benue people are the ones who have carried the heaviest cost of this unresolved crisis, and they are watching to see if this argument produces action or just more headlines.
So, where does this leave us, and what should you as a viewer be watching for going forward? Here is my honest take. The healthiest path out of this is proper documented consultation between the federal government and Benue State. Ideally with the specifics put in writing, not just traded through press statements and town halls. If there truly is no plan to force land acquisition, the Federal Ministry of Livestock Development should be able to say so clearly and directly to Benue's government and its people, not leave it to be inferred from a pilot list. And there are real open questions still hanging over this story that we do not yet have answers to. Has the federal government responded directly to Governor Alia's rejection? And if so, in what terms? Will Benue formally be removed from or retained on the pilot list as the Plateau phase begins? Will there be a written agreement clarifying how Benue's 2017 anti-open grazing law interacts with any federal ranching program? And critically, What concrete progress, if any, will we see on returning displaced Benue farming communities to their ancestral homes in the coming months? Those are the threads to keep pulling on as this story develops.
That is where we leave this story for now, but make no mistake, this is far from over. A federal policy this sensitive, touching land and security in a state that has already suffered so much, will not simply fade from the headlines. If this breakdown helped you understand what is really happening in Benue, do me a favor, like this video, share it with someone who needs the full picture and not just the rumors, subscribe if you have not already, and drop your own take in the comments because I read every single one. This is Naija News Online, bringing you the news the way it truly happened. No bias, no noise, just the facts as they unfold. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of one another.